Hello, this is Father Hightower, and welcome to Vox SFX, the voice of St. Francis Xavier Parish in Missoula, Montana. We are so pleased that you have joined us. Your participation enriches our entire community. We hope that our show serves as a point of light, helping to deepen our understanding and experience of the Catholic faith and history. So join us as we seek through prayer, study, interviews, and discussion the roots of the practice of our faith. God bless.
Hello, and welcome to Vox SFX, the voice of St. Francis Xavier Parish in Missoula, Montana. We're so very pleased that you could be with us today. This episode marks the last of our Advent series, where we talk about some of the sacred things that go on during this time of year. Last week, we talked about some of the preparation that goes on behind the scenes, and those hands that prepare the table that we all wish to eat from in the presence of the Lord. But there are other things that also contribute to this time of season. One of them is sacred music. A lot of times when we think of Christmas, we think of those old hymns, or even Mariah Carey. But whatever it is, it connects us to the season. Music allows us to express things we would otherwise have trouble articulating to others, or even feeling ourselves. It is an integral part of this season for us. Our music director, Robert Harsch, is on today to talk about what he takes into consideration when choosing which hymns to use and how to move the Mass along so that we can enjoy a fruitful experience in the presence of our Lord. But one of the interesting things about Robert is that he's not actually Catholic. I think he's the first person to be on this show, in fact, who is not. He's been working with the church for 14 plus years and has always been a fundamental part of making our liturgy special. But how does the season hit him? Is it different? Does he get a similar experience out of Mass as to those of us who go with the intent of worshiping? Well, you'll have to wait and see. So let's sit back and listen to Robert Harsch as he talks about the meaning of this season and how we can convey that through sacred music. Just a quick announcement before we begin this episode. We're going to be taking a short break in order to kind of rest up, get some new material together so that we can start fresh and strong next year. So please join us on January 16th when our new episode will be dropping about the baptism of Jesus. Thank you again for being with us. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and God bless. With us in the studio today is our music director here at St. Francis Xavier, Robert Harsch. Robert, thanks for coming in today.
My pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
So today we're talking about sacred music, which is to say the music that helps shape this season for us, because even though we have our prayers and we have our masses and we have our readings, there is something about the music when it comes to the sacred times of year that really make it what it is. So as the person kind of making those calls, what do you kind of base your decisions on?
Well, I work within a framework which really helps to set up some sort of guardrail so you have a target to aim for. Otherwise, there's so much music written through centuries to choose from that it helps to have a few things to focus your aim a little bit. One of the things to be considered in the music is whether it's a presentational piece where a choir or a cantor or a soloist is proclaiming something to the congregation, or whether it's a congregational piece where the congregation is encouraged or even expected to sing along and participate. And toward that end, most churches, including ours, will have a dedicated hymnal. So that is what is available for the congregation to sing from. So our choices begin with that, of what we have available. And in our case, it's the Gather hymnal published by GIA Publications Incorporated, the 2004 edition.
So brand spanking new is what I'm hearing.
Well, not entirely. It is a little outdated, especially since the ICEL approves the texts to be used for certain parts of the Catholic Mass. Our Mass parts were revised in 2010 when some of the text for the Holy changed and some of the text for the Gloria changed and a few of the creeds and some of the other spoken portions. So some of our music is a little outdated in that regard, but we have other options to acquire the newer Mass parts. One thing I have found in 14 years of playing piano at this parish from the same hymnal, there are still songs in there I'm not familiar with. So when I go around to pick out music, if there's something I don't know, I'm more inclined to try it, simply because it's new.
Sure.
And that could be tricky, introducing a new hymn to the congregation, because it's not something they're necessarily familiar with. A lot of people don't really read music as far as the notation to know the rhythms and the pitches, but they can follow along the words, and they sort of catch on with everybody else. So for new music, I try to seed it a little bit by playing it instrumentally as part of prelude for maybe a month in advance. I'll sneak it in there subliminally. And for things like new Mass parts, we might even just have the cantor and the pianist run through the Mass parts with the congregation a week or two prior. And we've done that at least once with our Advent Mass that's coming up as we record this. Or, as you're listening out there, we're in the midst of Advent, or it's past Christmas. You may be tuning in January 2025, for all I know.
You raise a really good point when you're talking about hymn selection, because in my experience, we have that massive hymnal that has so many songs in it, but most people only know like 20 of them. And so keeping it fresh, bringing in new stuff is... I think it's vital to making sure that things don't become stale.
I totally agree. Sometimes that feeling's not always served by everyone. I'm reminded of a Facebook meme where the angel of the Lord approaches the organist and says, "Behold, I have for thee a new hymn." And the organist sighed and said, "I cannot present a new hymn to the congregation, for they would rise up and smite me with pew cushions." And the angel went sorrowing away. But I think that may be a little overblown, as most humor is. I think people like things to be a little fresh and a little familiar. And our current hymnal, the Gather hymnal, has a nice balance. I forget what they claim their actual ratio is, but it might be a 50-50 blend of traditional and contemporary works. Although contemporary is at least 20 years old in our case. But there's still a nice difference of things that are post-Vatican II in the 60s. If anybody wants to delve into that, that's a future podcast, I think.
Very much so.
Of all the changes that happened in 1962, 63 to the Catholic Church. A lot more than what happened in 2010, where only a few texts were revised. As far as choosing the specific music within our hymnal, I have some wonderful aids to that. One publisher sends us a magazine called Today's Liturgy that comes from the Oregon Catholic Press, and they have lovely templates for every week that tells you what the readings are from the Missal, and even has a short summary of the passage, and plenty of room for you to write down which songs you want to put into which specific places in the Mass. And again, we have a layout. We have a template. We need a gathering song. There is either a sung Gloria or a sung penitential rite. And then there is a psalm, which is part of the lectionary readings. After that, there's the gospel acclamation, which announces, hey, we're going to sing, we're going to present the good news here. the gospel's coming up, pay attention. Then after the gospel reading and the homily, there's the preparation of the altar, where things are made ready for communion and the gifts are gathered. The offering is taken up and the collection is gathered and brought to the front. During that, the congregation and the choir sing. That one sometimes might be just a choir. If you have a very active choir that has some material to present, that's a good place to do it. And then in communion, I try to choose songs that have a refrain, something that the congregation can have in their heads to be able to sing when they're standing up, walking away from their hymnals to get in line to receive the Eucharist. In Advent, as we are now, I try to choose one that's a dedicated Eucharist song that mentions the body, the bread, the blood, the wine, somehow refers directly to the Eucharist gifts. And the other song during Advent, I try to choose an Advent song, an old carol or one of the reflective Advent hymns. Not quite Christmas music. That's a whole different thing, and it lasts for 2 days. But in Advent, we've got 4 weeks, and there's still a lot of music we only get to once a year. So I try to squeeze as many of those in as I can during this special season.
Well, and certainly during these special seasons, you're going to have crowd favorites, ones that are done frequently in the church and have come to be almost expected in a way.
Yes, and especially that becomes true on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. There are certain songs that are almost traditional because they serve the purpose so well. Joy to the World is very often the sending forth song. And not just at this parish, but other parishes I've worked at and played for. It's a wonderful way to send the congregation out into society with their hearts full of joy and song. So it will likely again this year be our closing song for the Christmas Day Masses and Christmas Eve Masses. Likewise, O Come, Emmanuel is a very, very appropriate gathering song because it's inviting Emmanuel to come join the congregation. And we will be using that throughout Advent with the first verse, the very familiar verse that everybody knows, every week. But for the second verse of the gathering song, we have a different one of 6 additional verses that exist. But I chose verses then that relate to the readings of the day. Or in this case, for the third Advent, if you're listening to this fresh when it's produced, that is Gaudete Sunday, or Joyous Sunday, Rejoice Sunday. So we definitely include anything that mentions rejoicing. If it's available in our hymnal, I try to squeeze it in on that day, just to have that tie-in to the specific reading.
And it's interesting that you talk about when we're going through just the Mass itself and the mood that you're trying to set within each of these phases of it, whether it's the gathering phase, the preparation phase, the Mass, like the celebration of the Eucharist. They've each got different energy to them. And I'm assuming that you've got not necessarily a playbook to choose from, but a very much an idea of what's supposed to fit where.
That is a very good point. I myself like to have a little bit more energetic gathering song because, again, it sets a mood for uplifting the spirit. This is a cool thing we're here to do. So I like to have something that's kind of energetic. But there are some occasions where a more somber, solemn procession is called for, especially in the early Sundays of Advent. Less
Lent,
so,
I imagine.
and
too.
Lent for sure. It's a time of reflection. It's a time of penance. And as is Advent. And they are both times of anticipation of something to come, that there's going to be a payoff at the end of this waiting. That sort of brings us to another traditional song, a very good closing song that we use here at St. Francis and has been used in my memory here as an Advent closing song for probably the last decade and a half. It's a Jacques Berthier piece called Wait for the Lord. This is part of the Taizé community in France, a monastic community that under Jacques Berthier's direction created these wonderful, simple, very singable pieces that can be done a cappella. They can be done with any type of instrumentation you care to use. And this particular song has a very simple refrain. The lyrics are, "Wait for the Lord, whose time is near. Wait for the Lord, be strong, take heart." And the congregation knows it very, very well. It's got a beautiful and relatively simple 4-part harmony for a choir to sing.
I love the bass part on that.
And I like the bass part and the tenor part. Depending on who we have available, I'll switch to either one. One thing that I do this year that's different from past years, and this is where I get to let my individuality shine through in a small crack, there's verses to that song that we've never sung. There are 5 verses. It's meant to be done right after the refrain and to go back into the refrain, but it's a different set of chords. It's a very short verse, a 1-line verse, a proclamation for the day. But for instance, the verse that I chose is actually for this weekend, for Gaudete Sunday, is actually verse 4 that in its listing, but we're only doing one verse, so it is the verse for the day. And this says simply, "Rejoice in the Lord always. God is at hand." So we will have the refrain of "Wait for the Lord, whose day is near. Wait for the Lord, be strong, take heart. Rejoice in the Lord always. God is at hand. Wait for the Lord, whose time is near. Wait for the Lord, be strong, take heart." And then we have the option of repeating it once more, possibly a cappella, in 4-part harmony. That's my goal.
Well, and that's the other part of doing this music, is to try to pick songs that are appropriate for the timing.
Oh, yeah.
Because it can be variable. Like for the gathering hymn, when people are coming down, the priest might come quicker than other times, might approach the altar and be ready quicker than other times. And so maintaining flexibility between the cantor and the pianists when it comes to these less predictable lengths of time is obviously important.
It is. And the cantor also has a double duty to communicate with the congregation as well as the pianist. If the cantor decides we need to repeat verse 1, then he or she can hold up a finger to the congregation to indicate we're going to sing verse 1. Hopefully some eye contact has been made with the pianist so they know not to take off in an improvised variation. And that brings us to the other point, is the ability to improvise. A lot of what I do as a pianist in the church is underscoring these times when there's nothing to be sung because we've sung the lyrics, but there's still motion going on, and there's still part of a procession perhaps in someone still approaching the altar or preparing the altar and getting things ready. I find that a wonderful, fun challenge. It's something that appeals to me with a background in theater of underscoring action or motion, or just keeping a mood going while something physical and maybe slightly mundane is going on. For instance, when we finished communion, this has been the high point of the Mass. This is the reception of the Eucharist and the body and bread. And afterwards, well, dishes have to be put away, cloths have to be folded up, towels tucked away, and the host returned to the cabinet. And this is a somewhat mundane action. It's not done in a grand style.
But if there was just silence, it might be kind of awkward.
It does. It feels empty. And if I can continue to extend the mood of communion a little bit until the necessary physical motion has been completed. The host has been returned to the sacramental altar and its casket, and the dishes have been set on the table off to the side. The Eucharistic ministers have all bowed and returned to their seats, and then the music wraps up, comes to a cadence. And then we can have a little bit of a pause, and during ordinary time, we will usually sing a meditation. During Lent and during Advent, typically we will go with a silent meditation, just befitting the somberness of the season. There is a little bit of deprivation involved too, because again, it's that anticipation of something that's going to return. The meditation song that our congregation has come to love is the Anima Christi, written by Donna Corey Gibson. I know some people are going to miss it when it goes away.
It's a gorgeous song.
It is beautiful. It's a lovely melody, nice chord progression. It flows, at least I think it does, just very slowly and gently in a predictable but not boring manner. You know, it just has a nice feel to it. But it will go away for 4 weeks. It'll come back after Christmas. We may also go to Silent Night on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And that might stay as a meditation through Epiphany or possibly the next weekend, which is the Baptism of the Lord. So within this calendar, I have, again, it limits my scope. What is appropriate and for the season? That makes a huge difference too.
Sure. And you had mentioned before also the challenges that come with being a pianist, not just knowing the tunes themselves and being able to communicate that with the congregation, but also having that skill to kind of improvise at the end of it and still have it be recognizable as that song, but be interesting to folks that are listening.
Yes, and that is one thing that I really enjoy doing. I was a theater major and a broadcasting major, not a music major. But while I was here at the university, I took composition classes, notably from Dr. Donald O. Johnston. And I took music theory classes from such luminaries as Dr. John Ellis, Dr. Patrick Williams, the late, great Dr. Don Simmons, who has a fairly well-known actor son, and another fairly well-known actor son. That's where I managed to put together all the pieces of scattered things I'd gathered from public school music, public school band, and then community chorale, community theater, music rehearsals, and being part of a singing group. Finally, I got to put it all together. Being able to improvise has been sort of the capper, and for that, I have a huge debt to Professor Lance Boyd at the University of Montana. From 1 year of jazz theory and improvisation, he gave me the tools I needed to put together all these scattered puzzle pieces of music. And that ability to improvise over changes has served me very well in the Catholic Church for those moments where I'm continuing to play a hymn, and it should be recognizable as the hymn, but I can embellish it or even do a theme and variations over the same chord progression. Or I might choose to reharmonize it a little bit if I'm on my own and I'm not going to confuse a cantor or a congregation or other singers. I have that leeway where I can deviate from the road map, but I usually come back to it. I stay pretty close to it. So it is a recognizable extension of the hymn that we've just sung.
Working with a cantor has to be an interesting experience because, like you said, it's not just you as the pianist working, although you're a massive part of it, but there's also another individual who you are kind of coordinating with. What kind of unique challenges are there in working with a cantor, and does a good cantor look like?
Oh, it's more importantly what the good cantor sounds like. But the qualities that make it easier to do my job are just people who are secure in doing their job. And that means that I can count on them to maintain their melody without me having to necessarily play it. Much of the time I am doubling the melody, especially for the congregation. But in latter passes, if the cantor has that melody down and they don't need me to guide them directly, then I can play counter melodies. I can invert the harmony and play something up above that is not at all what they're singing, but it still fits in with the chord progression and will help with the flow. And that's a big thing with cantors, with any ensemble. The musicians is having them work together to feel where the pulse of the music is going. It's not always a strict metronome, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. In fact, it very seldom is. That's why orchestras have conductors, so that they can get a flow of when things might just rise and hold a bit longer, and things might slow down altogether or maybe speed up, and you want to join. Everyone gets a little bit more galloping along to push ahead, and then that might come to a resolution and have a different flow into a refrain. And with those things, if you don't have a conductor, you rely on an intuitive feel between the musicians to understand where things are going, when they're going to change, and when they should stay a little more strict. And that involves eye contact and paying attention to body language, because a pianist or a guitarist will have their hands occupied, so they've really only got their face or their shoulders or their head to communicate, okay, we're going to do this, and it has to be nonverbal. It doesn't have to be, but ideally it should be.
You don't want to be shouting across, and, hey, we're going back to verse 4.
Yeah, that's fine in a rehearsal, and it will happen in rehearsal, but not at a mass, which is a performance for the musicians. This is important. It's not, hey, look at me performance, but it's, I've got a job to do, and this is me doing my job as best as I can do it performance. Balancing that is tricky sometimes. There's got to be a certain amount of confidence in a cantor, because they are leading the congregation. They are inviting the congregation to join and to sing along with them and the pianist. So we now sing as a group. And when you're in a group that is 100 or more, sometimes a couple of hundred individuals spread out over, that's got to be 150 feet from the altar to the balcony. It's a considerable distance.
And there's going to be delay when that's happening too. So you need a pianist and a cantor who are able to kind of keep the beat, keep the BPM without relying on the congregation to do the same.
Exactly. Because almost guaranteed the people at the very back of the hall are going to be a little late. Just a little bit. And if the cantors and the pianists are waiting to hear the congregation come back to them after reverberating around with at least a 2.5 second echo time or delay in that hall, things start to drag. They can easily drag down. And you have to stay kind of on top of it and be a little stubborn for the cantor and the pianist up there to not listen to the sound coming back. And sometimes that's not easy, because sometimes the sound coming back is glorious and you get caught up in that. And you just want to bask in that sound for a little bit. But if you linger too long in your bask, you will be late. And then the congregation will be later. And then you'll be late again. And I have witnessed tempos really drastically nosedive at times. And that will happen when the cantor's not so familiar with the piece, or when the pianist is not familiar with the piece, or both.
And I imagine it becomes even more of a challenge when we're dealing with the larger crowds that come in for, Christmas Eve. Suddenly you have a massive hall with muffled kind of response because of the number of bodies in there. That's some discipline right there.
And it will change. And it's not even so much that bodies absorb the sound so much, but they do change its pathway. And a couple hundred people standing around shuffling makes noise just by existing. Humans make noise. We breathe, we move, we turn pages.
We cough, we sniff.
Mm-hmm. We have children who exclaim at the top of their lungs at sometimes very humorous moments. So there is that to consider. It's always fluid. One of the things I noticed is I'm always up front. So since I've been in the position of music director for a couple of months, I've tried to attend a mass and sit in the back and experience what that's like. And one of the things I found out is that when the congregation in front of you is all singing, it's hard to hear the piano. Fortunately, as the movie Crossroads taught me, Muddy Waters done invented electricity, and we have a microphone for that piano.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a very involved sound system, which I'm getting acquainted with more and more. Fortunately, I have training from the recording workshop in Chillicothe, Ohio, my time as a broadcaster, my time doing 3 national tours as a front-of-house sound engineer for Montana Rep, and 2 seasons spent at Alabama Shakespeare Festival as a sound designer and engineer. So I'm familiar with the territory. And now that it's sort of my job, or explicitly in my contract is part of my job to keep track of that sound system, I've made small adjustments to turn up the piano sound in the very back of the church, but not up front. We don't need it up there. And we have the flexibility to only turn things up when we need them. So far, I think that has helped for any of that lag. Now when I sit in the back, I can sing along and be with the piano rather than react to it and end up behind the piano.
Well, that balance is important, making sure that, like you said, you're not sitting there being like, what's the tune? I'm trying to listen to the people around me, some of whom may not be in tune. That balance, the ability to have a sound system to achieve that balance is a huge boon to what we're doing. I can't imagine before the advent of a sound system in there trying to make sure that you were heard in the back of the church.
Well, it was definitely a simpler time. And as far as speaking or singing in that church without a microphone, it's really not that difficult.
We've got pretty good acoustics.
It does have a good ring, and you can make yourself heard. Now, singing with the pipe organ, which is the installed instrument in there, that becomes extra tricky. And that's not something we've dealt with a lot in my time here. And of course, I was always a pianist, so I myself didn't have to deal with an organ and the whole timing of it. But that is one of our great new adventures for this Advent, is getting the organ back in use. And we have a fine musician in our parish, Lydia Schmidt, who has played cello at masses in the past, but she's going to give a try to getting the organ involved for our Sunday morning masses during Advent and for some of our Christmas Eve and Christmas Day masses. We've had a couple practices with she and I, and you joined us for one, which was exceptionally helpful. The timing issue is not nearly as scary as I thought it was going to be. Tonight, as we record this, we will rehearse with the choir, with the organ and the piano and a cantor. I have no idea how it's going to go. But we're all going to show up and do our best and keep our fingers crossed, ask for whatever blessings are available, and give it our best shot. And I'm about 85% confident it's going to go very nicely.
Well, you had mentioned that there's an added complication when you start to throw in things like an organ and trying to coordinate, because our organ is in the very back of the church. And so that delay that we had spoken of is an important thing to consider when you've got a very prominent instrument that you're trying to coordinate the sound with.
Yes, and Lydia herself has an exceptionally tricky job because the organ itself is a mechanical instrument. It relies on air physically traveling through pipes and tubes and bellows moving and pumping in order to produce the sound that it does. As such, that sound production alone takes time. So an organist has to anticipate the beat and play a little bit ahead just to be on the beat. And when you're dealing with a piano that's 150 feet away, the organ has to almost lead. And yet the piano, with its percussive nature, is a little bit better at delineating the subdivisions and the beat than the organ with its more sustained tones. So it's a nice dance between the two instruments and finding that balance of each doing its part to keep the overall groove flowing together. And then we add the singers to that, and they've got to be aware of what to listen for that's going to help them stay in that groove, in that flow, and to not be distracted by something that seems late. Because there will be something. There will be an echo that might pop up. A different overtone might show up a full second later because it's being reinforced by the sound waves bouncing against each other and redoubling, or in some cases, cutting other frequencies with phase cancellation. Now we get into all sorts of sciencey weird stuff that I know a little bit about, but probably not enough to answer all questions thoroughly.
No, and we have, we're very lucky to have Lydia. Not only is she, like you said, an organist, but those of you who have been listening to the podcast for any length of time and have heard the cello in the beginning and the transition and the end, that's also Lydia's handiwork. So she has already even contributed to this podcast in a big way.
Good. And it is also wonderful to expand the palette of music. Most of the year, we have one piano and one vocalist. But Advent and Lent and Christmas and Easter, they are special. Just by the very definition of the calendar, everything else is ordinary. That's what they call it, ordinary time. But these special occasions and special times of the year are the ideal time to expand our palette and to bring these different colors of sound into the church, especially here in the time of winter, to have that extra warmth of the organ that just flows around you, because the entire hall is part of the instrument. The reverb chamber of the sanctuary is part of the instrument, and the congregation is within that. I think it's a special sound we have not had enough of, and I'm going to try to get as much of it as I can in the next couple of weeks.
And there's a lot of opportunity for that as well, because when this podcast is going to be releasing, we've got the antiphons coming up as well.
That is true, and I am only just beginning to dive into those also. But we have the option of some additional pre-processional music that is very traditionally played on chimes. Now, sadly, our mechanism for our chimes isn't always as responsive as we'd like, but we'll get in what we can. I think that's a wonderful sound, that bell sound, a musical bell passage. It's just a little tricky with the limitations of a 120-year-old instrument. Of course, the chimes that are probably the trickiest thing mechanically are very, very difficult to get to for servicing and maintenance. We did have a technician come in and did what he could to mostly get the keyboard responsive and a few pipes. He did some patching with moleskin and glue. What we've got is a freshly tuned organ with some temperamental chimes. But that's what we've got to work with, and we'll make the best what we do have to work with, we'll make the best of.
Well, and it's an instrument that is also environmentally sensitive. So whether or not it's warm or cold or dry or wet, that kind of influences the sound that comes out as well.
Yes, and I think also the long time when it was sitting not being used. I think just like any machine, being operated helps it to maintain itself. Like our own joints and muscles, if you don't move them, they get stiff. And I hope to continue having more use out of the organ. It's an instrument to me that is a little foreign. I play keyboards, but again, the reaction of the mechanical air-forced organ is different from the hammer percussion of a piano, and that levered action, it's mechanical in a different way. It requires a different touch. There is no sustain pedal on the organ. If you let go of that key, you lose that note. There's nothing that's going to hold it down for you while you move to the next one. So you have to rethink the way you finger melodies if you want them to be legato. You can't just rely on stepping on a pedal and moving your hand while the mechanism is just lifted to let it ring. And it takes a lot of getting used to. And thankfully, Lydia has more experience playing the organ than I do. And I think between the two of us, we will complement and create a larger palette.
I certainly enjoyed being there with y'all when you were figuring things out the other day and just getting wrapped in that sound. It's a treat. It is a treat.
I hope it'll be a treat for the congregation as well and make the special season of Advent more special. That is our job, to elevate things. Hearing a scripture passage is one way to experience that passage. Having the same words sung takes it to a different level. As a congregation member, the hymns are a way for them to also expound the scripture passage, and in an elevated manner and in a way that is natural to humans, to just about any culture.
We do like music.
We do. It's one of the earliest things that as art forms that humans have probably come up with, just from a simple communication of pitching your voice up to have it carry across a field to signal someone, to call to them, and then to express emotion. And the different emotions that we can express through music become heightened with the angst of sorrow, the joy and elation of a song of praise or thanksgiving. All of it just raises it just a little bit more, just one more notch higher in spirituality, in an intellectual pursuit. It's another way to make things more complicated, more intricate, and therefore more special to us.
And that special sound, it also is increased by the type of music that we're listening to. So throughout most of the year, we have a pianist and a cantor. And right now we're talking about adding that, the complication and awesomeness of having an organ involved. But then we also have a choir, which is its own beast as well.
Yes, it is. A melody line sung is beautiful. Add a harmony to it, and it just elevates it again. I keep using that word, but it is sort of taking things to a higher level to make them more intricate and more beautiful. It's like you have a lovely line drawing sculpture or a building or a tree or anything, or a person, a portrait, a line drawing portrait. If you add colors to that, bring out the watercolors, bring out the pastel paints, the oil paints, it just refines it, adds a little rococo, a little ornamentation, and more vibrancy, more life comes into the picture. And the same way as adding a harmony or a third harmony or a fourth harmony, to where human voices are generating the chords behind a melody to support it. That takes it again to a fullness, a richness that it didn't have before. And if you can get a counter melody, now you've interwoven something else that's different, a different voice, a different scripture passage, where there may be two completely different thoughts that are related, interweaving. That's really difficult to do in a congregational setting because the people who would most appreciate hearing that are busy because they're singing along. But in a presentational setting, for something that might be a prelude song or a preparation song, or sometimes even a meditation, a post-communion song, where we allow the congregation to just sit and take it in instead of having to participate. Although it's a joy to participate, there's also a certain joy to letting a beautiful passage wash over you and receive that just as a listener without having to worry about, do I sound okay? What's that word? I can't quite read it.
Yeah, no, it is certainly something special and something that contributes to the season mightily. And we are lucky to have you, somebody who is well-versed in what it takes to make this special.
Well, thank you. I do have some knowledge that allows me to put the pieces together, but those pieces are exceptionally important, and you can't do it without cantors. You can't do it without other musicians, the other pianists that play at the masses that I don't play at, and having Lydia join us on organ, having multiple voices join us as a choir. The contributions that everybody makes add up to this grander whole that we are going to create together as a team. That sort of brings me to the one word that is often misunderstood as a pianist in a church. You are called an accompanist. And some people don't really think about what that word means. The piano's not there to lead. The piano's not there to follow. The piano is there to accompany the singers. We go on the journey together. There's a little give and take. Sometimes somebody walks in front of the other and you trade places a little bit. Sometimes you're side by side. Sometimes you're holding hands. It's that close. But it's always that we're going together to an agreed upon destination, and we're accompanying each other on this journey.
I like that. That's a nice way to put it. Well, before we break for the day, I did want to touch on one thing more. You yourself are not Catholic, but you are surrounded by Catholics and have been working with us for, you said, about 14 years at this point?
14 years at this parish.
What is that like, to be around and to not necessarily be... When I say present, I don't mean like not being there in terms of being musically engaged and being engaged with the congregation and the musical aspect of it, but the ceremony doesn't mean as much. Or just tell me about it. Tell me about what it's like.
I wouldn't say that it doesn't mean as much, but it is different. It's got to be. My perspective is a little bit of an outsider. I grew up attending Missouri Synod Lutheran Church as a youth, which is basically Catholic light. It's the more formal of the Lutheran branches. But my first interaction in a Catholic church was because I answered an ad in the newspaper for a piano player at Christ the King, where they have the Newman Center and the Catholic Campus Ministry. I'd never attended a Catholic service before, so I picked up a packet of music and I attended a service that weekend to listen to what they were doing. And I practiced the pieces I had at home. And I went and auditioned for the music director. At the time, it was a gentleman named John Jacobs. He sang as a cantor while I played. And he had some other selections where he just had me just play, where he didn't sing. And then he handed me two pieces and said, sight read these for me. One of them was a lead sheet. It was just the melody line, the lyrics, and the chords. No bass line, no harmony parts written. And it said, gospel swing, 3/4 time. It was a gospel blues waltz.
Nice.
And my jazz theory and improvisation background And having seen my dad's fake books and knew what to expect from a fake sheet, I was able to comply with his request, which is sight read a piece of music that is not complete. You've got the bare skeleton of what you need to make this into a singable song. And fortunately, my background allowed me to do that, and he offered me the job. And I said, well, John, you should know I'm not Catholic. And he said, that's okay. I need a piano player, not a Catholic.
Practical, very practical.
It is very practical. And I've been playing for the Catholic churches ever since. From word of mouth, I went to one parish and was playing at both of those for a while. And then things opened up at some point after I'd been on tour. I was hired as a musical director for Holy Family Parish. And that parish then merged with Pope John the 23rd to become the Blessed Trinity Parish. And shortly after that, a position opened up here where I started playing here as a pianist. And now I'm musical director here at the oldest Catholic parish in town. And I still am a bit of an outsider because I'm not fully immersed in the Catholic doctrine. But it doesn't mean I don't have faith or beliefs. I think my early religious beliefs were shaken and stirred in high school by expanding my reading knowledge into people like Harlan Ellison, who very often wrote very anti-religious short stories and essays, and other anti-faith, I would say, writers in science fiction, where it was all about the science and you didn't deal with magic or things in the supernatural or things you didn't understand or things like that. It didn't even figure into it, or those solutions were shunned and at times ridiculed by some authors. And then there was one thing that, again, shifted my perspective, and that was The Power of Myth with Bill Moyers and the great Joseph Campbell. That television series on PBS made me look at mythological writings and religious writings and stories in a completely different manner. Later on, I took university mythology course, and Professor John Hay gave me a wonderful phrase: you find the universal in the specific. So when you're looking at a specific story or a specific myth or a parable, there's a universal underlying truth that is within that narrative, perhaps as a metaphor, perhaps very directly, as in, this is an example of what we deal with as a human being. And this is how this character, or this human, dealt with it. And then there are also the metaphorical things where the text presents a strange and fantastical image or situation that doesn't necessarily relate to something that everyday people deal with. It's something that's on another level. And yet it's universal in that something about this specific example is something we all face within us in slightly different ways, because we all have slightly different journeys, but we are all essentially the same. And that shows up very directly in the Christian gospel, as well as other religions, of Jesus's 2 commandments. When he was asked, what is the greatest commandment? He says, well, there's 2. The first is you love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The second is like it. I believe one of the translations has Jesus saying the second is like it, which you could rephrase in the vernacular of the second one is basically the same thing. You love your neighbor as you love yourself. It's the same thing. If you do one of those commands, you will fulfill the other. Either one it's the same thing. Loving God, loving your neighbor, loving yourself. There's a different Trinity, and it's all connected in a strange, mysterious way. And the Indian greeting of the Sanskrit, namaste. I see you. I recognize you. You are me. Is kind of similar to what Jesus was saying, I think. That's my interpretation through the lenses of mythology and growing up in a Christian household and being presented with all the Christian stories from the Bible through Sunday school, through catechism class, and through attendance of church as a parishioner, and being part of the presentations for Christmas and Advent. That was a big thing. As kids, we would get up there and recite the narratives, and because I was a decent reader, I got the long passages from Isaiah and Jeremiah, all the Lamentations and the big words and the strange, weird metaphorical concepts that it's a little tricky for a second grader to wrap their head around.
For sure.
It's a little tricky for a septuagenarian to wrap one's head around. But looking at things from an outside, I see the importance of ritual. And what Joseph Campbell explained to Bill Moyers and to the audience at large of how ritual affects our psyche, our thought process, our emotions, and our way of life. So I don't receive the Eucharist, and I don't necessarily recite all of the creeds because it isn't what in my rational mind I view as straight fact, but I look at the metaphor underneath and the inner meaning that another religion has a different name for. But it's a similar search for connection to ourselves, to each other, to the cosmos in general, whatever that might look like or not look like.
Would it be accurate to say that even though you're not Catholic, you still get something profound from the experience of Mass?
Oh, yes, especially for myself through the music. That is my connection. That's my path to the metaphor of how we reach that meaning. For me, very often it is just in the music. My favorite time of Mass is 10 or 15 minutes before, when I'm playing a prelude, because I'm looking at a hymn, usually just a standard arrangement of a hymn. It might be some pianist's harmonization or other arrangement of that piece, but it's notes, it's chords, it's lyrics. There's a text there that has a very distinct verbal meaning. But it's also poetry, so poetry has metaphorical and simile connections and allusions and other things that are less direct, but they're there. And the music itself is yet another expression of emotion that is the text painting, sometimes very directly. When the lyrics speak of rising, the melody might go up. If you take away the lyrics and you have just the music, the connotation of the lyrics is still there. I'm looking at them, even if the people in the congregation don't necessarily know the song. I try to convey the meaning of the lyrics that I'm reading. And sometimes I'm not even playing the melody that would be sung at that point. I might be improvising a completely different melody, but I'm thinking of the lyrics. Thou preparest before me a table in the presence of mine enemies. Except it's in Spanish. In the particular thing I'm looking at. And while I'm playing a melody that people in the congregation might think is, oh, that sounds like a Mexican folk melody. Well, it is. But in my head, I'm hearing, El Señor es mi pastor, nada me falta. The Lord is my shepherd. Whom shall I fear? There's nothing I shall want.
Well, like I said before, and I want to reiterate again, we are exceptionally lucky to have you, sir, and I feel especially honored that you chose to come on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I can rant and ramble about music from many different angles.
Well, I'll probably have you back on to do it again.
Well, we'll probably find a different angle that we haven't touched on.
I love it. Well, Robert, thanks again for coming on.
And thank you.
Thank you for being with us today as we walk as pilgrims this road together. If you feel called to learn more, please consider checking out St. Francis Xavier or your local Catholic church. All are welcome into our community as God loves us all equally. If you are interested in supporting the Vox SFX podcast, please visit sfxmissoula.org/donate. Until next time, go forth in peace and be the light of Christ in someone's day.